Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and my guest today is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're going to talk today about the rather dramatic increase in online Alexander teaching that's taken place over the past several weeks, and what the implications of that are, and what for those teachers who have not experimented with it, some thoughts about how they might want to begin. Imogen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'd like to begin with a quote by a Swedish teacher, Maria Bennett, who is one of many, many teachers who've really just started teaching online and has been almost, I would say, shocked by how efficient it is or how helpful it can be. And this is what she wrote, and I think it says a lot. She writes, and this is on Facebook where she posted it, so fascinated by this new teaching medium. So much of the hands-on work can turn into fixing and showing the students something that they maybe just needed time to discover for themselves. This is my experience this morning with a student. She suddenly understood how she can do this Alexander thinking for herself and was itching to go off and play. And then she adds, this is definitely making me a better hands-on teacher as well. So looking forward to coming back to that with these skills. And I think that sums up a lot of what's going on right now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that actually has been my own experience from when I first started experimenting with doing a little bit of online teaching with a good friend of mine over 6 years ago now. And then I've done quite a bit more over these years. And, as we practice, and I've also learned with a few teachers of some things that have really helped me. But that it has absolutely had a positive impact on my in-person teaching. So after this whole COVID-19 situation is over and we can interact in person with people again, I think even if you decide that online teaching isn't maybe for you forever, you will have learned some things that will help you be a better teacher, basically.
I think so. I think so. One of my pet peeves has always been that I find that students who have had traditional lessons, if they have a lesson with me, one of the first things I'll ask them is, what do you, I ask them what their understanding of Alexander directions are, self-directions are, and very few of them have any idea of how they might use that for themselves. It's kind of shocking. And with online teaching, if you teach a student directions online, they will then know how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's no hands to help do the thinking for them, right?
There's no coming back to a teacher for a fix. It just isn't possible. It's clearly on you, the student, to learn this material, and it is incredibly, as we said in an earlier podcast, it's incredibly empowering for students to
Yeah.
be in that position. Um, so I wonder, I mean, the people that we hear about her teaching, of course, are people who are on Facebook primarily, which is where the really interesting discussions are going on. Um, but for someone perhaps who's not on Facebook or who has sort of watched this from the sidelines, what would you suggest to a teacher who is hesitant about exploring online teaching?
Well, the way I started was by exploring in what felt a very safe way with a friend of mine. So that could be, so it didn't matter what the outcome was. In fact, I didn't know whether this online teaching stuff would work at all when I first started. Very, very pleasantly pleased and surprised. So maybe finding a very low stakes way to explore would be the first way to dip your toes in. Um,
Or another possibility would be a student that you already have from before,
yes.
and you put it to them as an experiment in learning, and so no one has to worry about achieving any specific results, and
Which
just see
is
what
kind of
happens.
always the case, really,
Which was
right?
always the case, but
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I think we Alexander teachers are not immune from end
Yes.
gaining in our thinking.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, I found that to be the case
Yeah, no,
occasionally.
that's a great, yes,
Yeah,
that's true too. A current student or that you've had, that you're very have a good rapport with would be perfect.
right. Might be worth. This podcast is not really about specific instructions on how to do online teaching, but it does seem to me there's certain aspects of the technique that would be a great place to start because they are so easily teachable online. I mean, one of the things that jumps out at me is constructive rest.
Yeah,
That really um, I mean, a lot of people can learn that completely on their own without a teacher. Where a teacher could come in handy might be in helping calibrate the height of books under the
yeah.
student's head, something like that.
And you can sort out the cameras so you can, check how they're setting themselves up. You can maybe give some suggestions how they get in and
Right.
out of the constructive rest
Yes,
position.
absolutely. Yeah.
And there's a lot of benefit to giving a little guidance as they lie there, things to think about and be aware of.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do with constructive rest. You can just show someone how to do it and not tell them anything to specifically do during it. But then after excuse me, they're comfortable with it. You can add thoughts, directions that would be very useful for them while they're in constructive rest. So it's kind of an open-ended process. So that excuse me, that's something for sure that um, I think most teachers wouldn't have too much trouble doing. And,
Absolutely, and can be hugely beneficial. So that would be a very easy way to start with a brand new person and a
right,
very
right,
effective and useful tool that you're giving that person.
right. And another tool that you can give people pretty easily is some basic body mapping information.
Hmm.
You don't need hands-on for that. Um, Depending on the student and what they're interested in, you might want to start with the head neck relationship and go through that and get them to map it on themselves. And um, or if it's someone who
Sit bones.
sits
Yeah.
bones, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, just waking people up to the fact that they have sits bones
Hmm.
and that those are perfectly designed to support them and move around on a chair can make a giant difference in somebody's life. And some basic mapping around how the arms and hands and arms, elbows, how all those joints work when you move your arms to do something like play a musical instrument or play piano or whatever. That something can be done online pretty easily too. So there's some things that you can do online that really don't really necessarily require any hands-on guidance.
Right. I'm thinking back to especially when I first started, But I mean, I still draw on these things to this day. If you've done any sort of group teaching where you guide explorations for the whole group, they can often be really useful things to bring into online teaching
Right.
because
Or, yeah.
they've not involved hands-on to start with, most likely.
Right. And let's not forget that if what you want to do is teach groups online, Zoom, for example, allows you to do that. Pretty
Absolutely.
much
Yeah.
as many people as you want
Yep.
on Zoom. Now, the other area that I've always tended to emphasize in my own teaching has been teaching teaching students how to use Alexander directions.
Yeah. I pretty
Yeah.
much start with that now.
Well,
Yes. Yeah.
I sometimes I've learned not to always start with that
Yeah.
online, but I certainly get into it pretty quickly
Hmm.
within a lesson or two. But you know what we have today that we didn't have 20 years ago is we have some vastly superior directions that we can use, in my
Yeah.
opinion. And I'm
Well,
thinking of
I,
freedom directions and
mhm.
some of the negative, so-called negative directions. They are way easier to teach somebody, and they're more effective too than a lot of the
Yeah,
traditional
I
directions.
agree. I think the traditional directions tend only to be effective if you can have a strong association with what they mean, which has probably been brought to you through many hands-on experiences.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and and I guess the downfall, of course, is trying to recreate that experience. But most teachers have ways they try and guide their students out of that.
right.
I am a big fan of many other ways, including, the freedom directions. That's I am free to, or um, my neck is free way of expressing directions or thoughts, the
Hmm.
negative or inhibitory directions. And I also use Mia Morales's way of noticing ease.
Hmm.
They all seem more accessible, um, um, certainly initially, but also, I mean, in the long term, to me.
Yeah, yeah, and I think um, what I've emphasized a lot with in-person students and online students is it's not just learning what these directions, but it's
Yeah,
learning how to use them because
yeah.
there are a lot of ways you can use a direction, and some of them are not very helpful. Like you could cling on to it. You could just say, "Well, I'm just going to think this 24/7," or or you
Good luck
could,
with that.
yeah, or you could decide to modify it in some creative way, which probably is not going to work until you've really gotten some experience. In other words,
Yeah.
people have a lot of ways of taking a direction that you suggest they use
Hmm.
and creating their own version of it, which is not going to be very helpful. So you have to really you have to work with people to make sure they actually are using the direction in the way you would like them to do. But all of that is not none of that is inherently a hands-on process.
No, I
It's all
mean,
it's
it's
yeah.
surprising how much you can observe,
Mm-hmm.
especially once you've done it quite a lot, how much you
Mm-hmm.
can observe through the computer screen, how
Right.
much you can hear from people's voices
Right.
and the changes in them,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, their feedback.
Exactly.
You know,
And by the way, in terms of feedback, we should mention that I think most teachers who do online lessons now will record the lesson and send a copy to the student. So the student may possibly for the first time ever in their life is seeing views of themselves, for example, sideways, standing up, or that sort of thing, that they've never really seen before.
mm,
And they can often see the changes that come about from changes in how they're thinking about themselves as they move. So
mhm.
the student gets to play with that recording for as long as they want. They may want to hear a certain explanation several times. They can just play,
Right.
So I know some teachers actually believe that the lesson is almost less important than the recording of the lesson.
Yeah, I'm not quite there,
I'm
but
not quite there either,
I know what you
yeah.
mean. And I'm thinking about this experimenting aspect, exploring, which I think is hugely important in any lesson. Um, but I guess a tip or advice, if you like, is maybe very obvious, is to have your student play with contrasting how they normally do something with when they are doing some sort of directing or constructive thinking, or comparing how when they think this particular thing, which they often think, with when they um, explore another direction.
Yeah, and I think students will often surprise you with
Mhm.
how much they notice.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah.
and I think just in sort of broader looking towards the future of Alexander teaching terms, I think what's going on now is going to affect Alexander teaching very significantly from now on. Because I think once people start to discover the usefulness of online teaching, um, it's just going to be it's going to be part of their practice. And
Yeah, absolutely. The things that I started out with doing more for online students are now in my in person, or they were while I was doing in person. I'm not, of course, at the moment.
yes, well,
Um,
that's what I found as well. That
yeah.
my online teaching has really affected my in-person teaching. But
Yeah.
another thing is that with online teaching, your potential student body is billions of people, and so one of the things that's happening now is teachers are having students halfway around the world from them.
Hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes teachers in those countries are having students in your country. I mean, there's this amazing interaction going on that I think cuts through all kinds of different teaching styles, different ways of thinking about the technique.
Yeah.
I just think it's opening up things in a way that is ultimately very healthy for the Alexander world. I know there are people who were and maybe still are appalled by online teaching, but I'm definitely not one of them from my own
Hmm.
experience.
Yeah.
And
Well, me neither. And
yeah,
it, for me, started very much as an experiment. I had no idea if it was going to be helpful. And what really um, convinced me was, one, I was, I knew I was being helpful to my friend who I started with, but I actually was able to see her in person several months later and gave her an in-person lesson. And it was completely clear that this was not a beginner.
yeah,
Her,
yeah,
it, and to me, that was the proof was in the pudding, if you know that expression.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think the bottom line of our conversation is if you're kind of on the edge of thinking, well, maybe I'll give it a try, well, take a little risk and do so.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
I don't think you have much to lose, and you might be really pleasantly surprised at the outcome.
I think you will be. Um, yeah, and there are
Well,
plenty of resources that teachers who have been doing online work are offering and help. Another thing you could do is get a session with an online someone who's been working online for a while,
sure, why
and
not? I mean,
you know
that's
to kind of get a glimpse of how
yeah,
they're doing it. That could
and
be another
and
idea.
Right, and bear in mind that just as has always been the case with in-person lessons, there are some dramatic differences in the way different teachers teach this work.
Absolutely, and it's the same with
Very
online work.
dramatic. I mean,
Yeah,
extraordinarily dramatic differences.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if you really felt like you'd want to have some experience of it before you jump into it teaching, well, then take a few lessons.
yeah,
Take lessons from different teachers. Um, that would be a good strategy too. But I also think if you're on the edge, I would just jump in and try it and
yeah,
see what happens.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think there's much risk there to that. So is there anything else you want to add to this?
Yeah, no, I just completely agree. Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'll put a link to a couple of Facebook groups that are sort of uh, places for exploring. There's one group that is specifically devoted to online teaching. That might be the most useful one to join if you want. Um, and or you don't even have to join. You could just tune into it, and then if you wanted to join, you could. So yeah, give it a go. And my guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware, and I'll put a link to her website as well. So Imogen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert.